Good morning, and welcome to Taking the Pain Out of Migrating SharePoint to the Cloud. My name is Holly Anderson. I'm a product manager at K2, specifically for K2 App It for SharePoint. We'll talk a little bit more about what exactly K2 and K2 App It for SharePoint is a little bit later, but first let's jump into a quick agenda for today's session. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the benefits of moving SharePoint to the cloud. What are the things that you're going to get when you move into an environment that is cloud-based? Next, we'll talk a little bit about some of the common concerns that we are hearing when people are looking at moving to the cloud. Although there are a lot of benefits, certainly many people have a lot of concerns as they're looking at that migration plan. Next, we'll talk about some steps that you should follow for a successful migration into the cloud. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about some tools and resources that are available for you as you're planning your migration. Finally, we'll wrap up with some Q&A time at the end of the session. So let's go ahead and jump right in. First of all, in terms of cloud benefits, there's a lot of tangible benefits that you can get from moving your SharePoint environment into the cloud. First of all, just in terms of maintenance and management costs, you're going to see a decrease in the amount of money that you're going to have to spend on that maintenance because of the decreased amount of infrastructure that you need for this environment. Since your SharePoint Online environment is all hosted with Microsoft, a lot of that server maintenance that you normally would have to do for your SharePoint environment is taken care of for you. Next, you're going to have access to all of the latest features and bug fixes without the need to upgrade. Now, this is something that is very important as you're trying to maintain your SharePoint environment so that you do get all of the latest and greatest features. Microsoft does regular updates to their SharePoint Online environment, not just with bug fixes that they come up with, but also with adding additional features that will help you build the applications that you need to on SharePoint and really provide a nice working environment for your users in their SharePoint Online environment. Next, because SharePoint Online and Office 365 is a subscription-based model, your expenditures on your SharePoint environment are going to be much more predictable. Your model is going to be based on a per month subscription basis, and that's not going to change across each month unless you need to do things like add additional users or additional storage capabilities. Now, some people think this is a little bit unintuitive because of moving into the cloud. Things may seem a little bit less secure, but actually moving to the cloud is going to provide you a much more secure environment, not only in terms of being able to get those latest and greatest bug and security updates pushed into your environment automatically, but also just in terms of the ability that you're going to have to kind of monitor what's going on in your environment. You have a lot more ability to kind of see exactly what's going on in your environment and really gives you a much more secure SharePoint Online experience. You're also going to get a greater level of the ability to collaborate with all of the users that you may be working with, whether those users are internal employees or maybe you have some vendors or some customers that you collaborate with on a regular basis. Allowing them to get into a SharePoint Online environment is going to be much easier to set up and maintain across the long run in an online environment rather than in your on-premises environment. So it really gives you a nice way to kind of interact very easily with those external users that you may be involved with in your everyday business. Now, because of these benefits that you're going to see with SharePoint Online, we're seeing that a lot of users are planning to move to SharePoint Online. At the last survey that was done by AIM, about 34% of users were planning to move at least some of their information onto an online environment. Now, while this number isn't extraordinarily high, it does represent about double the number of people who were going to be moving to SharePoint Online in the previous survey a couple years ago. So we're definitely seeing a lot of people start to look at migrating at least some of their information into a cloud-based environment. But what are the reasons why people are not yet looking to do that? There are definitely some concerns that many people have when they're looking at this move. Couple of things that we've seen our customers talk about are things like feature parity. So one of the things that some people are finding is that there are differences between the functionality that you get with SharePoint on premises versus what you get with SharePoint in the cloud. Now, this is something that Microsoft is working very hard to kind of level the playing field, if you will, to make sure that there's not a lot of feature parity gaps in the online version, but it's something to be aware of. There are certainly tools out in the marketplace that can help with this, and certainly as Microsoft kind of adds more and more functionality to the cloud-based environment, you're certainly going to see this gap decrease, but it's something to be aware of. Now, despite kind of all of the different security features that you're going to get when you move to SharePoint Online, there are a lot of people who still have concerns about security, particularly when they want to integrate with other line of business systems in their environment. Now, this is something that you should be aware of, and you want to make sure that as part of your planning process, you really understand what all of the business systems are that you're going to be connecting to and what those security implications are. Certainly, while this is something to be aware of, it's not something that is going to cause a lot of problems for you. You're definitely going to be able to set up your SharePoint Online environment so it is very secure, in many cases more secure than what you get with your on-premises environment, but just something to be aware of. A lot of people also already have custom development or custom applications in their SharePoint on-premises environment. And this is something that if you have a lot of that customization, you're really going to have to look at kind of what all has been done, and you want to make sure that it's also available for your SharePoint Online environment. If you do have those custom development pieces, it's just something to keep in mind as you're moving to a cloud-based environment, that maybe there's going to be some of those applications that will need to continue living on your on-premises environment. So therefore, you may need something like a hybrid environment, which we'll talk a little bit more about in just a few minutes. Finally, one of the things that our customers have really kind of struggled with is that lack of governance model that many organizations may be struggling with their current SharePoint on-premises environments. Now, SharePoint has been so prolific in uptake across multiple different types of organizations that what we've really seen is that the SharePoint environments have just kind of exploded and expanded so much without a lot of thought for exactly how the sites need to be set up, what exactly is happening in your SharePoint environment. And because of that, many folks have kind of concerns about moving that kind of ungoverned SharePoint environment into something like a cloud-based environment without kind of cleaning all of that stuff up. So that's something to be aware of if you have kind of a proliferation of SharePoint sites in your organization. Definitely something that you want to look at as you're moving to the cloud, but again, not something that's insurmountable when you're moving to the cloud, just something to be aware of. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the steps for a successful migration to the SharePoint Cloud. Now, these are something that we have talked to our customers at K2 about extensively and feel like this is a really good set of kind of steps that are going to help make your migration as successful as possible. I'll go through these kind of at a high level and then we'll jump into each one individually. So first of all, it's very important to assess what your current content looks like in SharePoint. Next, need to review those integrated applications and line of business systems to determine exactly what needs to be done to continue using those applications in the same manner. Third, you absolutely want to plan out your new SharePoint architecture. This isn't just about kind of how many site collections you're going to have, but also exactly what your SharePoint environment is going to look like in terms of connections to other line of business systems. Fourth, you want to make sure that you're going to migrate your critical sites first. Now, this may seem a little unintuitive, but I'll talk a little bit about why you may want to do that as we get into the details here. Next, you're going to want to move your content in stages. Now, this does mean that the process is going to take a little bit longer, and while you're doing that, you're going to be kind of running two different environments, but it is something that we have seen people be very successful at as they're moving content in individual chunks instead of kind of all at the same time. Finally, you may want to consider a fresh start. Depending on what customizations have been done in your SharePoint environment, how kind of crazy your SharePoint sites have gotten, it may just be easier to consider a fresh start. So we'll talk a little bit about why you may want to do that in just a minute. So let's jump into each one of these individually. First of all, assess your current content. So this is something that's very important because of SharePoint Online subscription model is going to be based on, in part, how much storage you're actually going to be using in your SharePoint environment. So it's important to look at what content is currently being used. Is there any of that content that can be retired? What's the cleanup process going to look like here? Not just in terms of unstructured and structured content that you may be storing in your SharePoint environment, you also need to look at content in terms of what workflows or forms do you have in your environment. Do you have workflows and forms that you want to move into your SharePoint Online environment, or are they going to stay in your on-premises environment? Finally, in terms of content, you also need to determine who needs to access the content. Again, is this something that's going to be just an internally focused application where only your internal employees are going to be interacting with the content? Or do you need to look at expanding that out to your external vendors and customers as well? Something important to kind of keep track of as you're beginning the planning for your migration process so you know exactly how your environment needs to be set up. In terms of the applications and systems that you may already be running in your SharePoint environment, it's important to kind of keep track of everything that you are already using. Are you using third-party applications for something like workflow? Are you connecting to line of business systems to pull in information into your SharePoint portal in a particular way? It's very important to keep track of all of those applications and to make sure that they are all supported in the SharePoint Online environment. Now, as I mentioned, Microsoft is working to kind of decrease that feature parity gap that we have between SharePoint on-premises and SharePoint Online, but there are still some things that are not completely supported in your SharePoint and Online environment. Certainly some of that code customization that you may have done may be done quite differently in your SharePoint Online environment just because of the access level that you have in a cloud-based environment. Outside of those applications and systems that you're already using, what features specifically are you needing to look at? Do you need things like workflow in your environment as you're moving to SharePoint Online? Or are you just going to have kind of a very basic SharePoint Online setup where you don't need as many features maybe as you thought you did in your on-premises environment? In terms of a hybrid configuration, this is something that may be necessary if you do have those applications or custom code running in your SharePoint on-premises environment that just isn't supported in your SharePoint cloud-based environment. If that's the case, you are allowed to create an environment that gives you the ability to run both your SharePoint on-premises environment as well as a SharePoint Online environment. But there are definitely some things to know about the hybrid environment as you're going into it. So very important to kind of determine, is this something that you need to think about? If it is, you need to think about what applications are going to run in your on-premises environment, what's going to run in your cloud-based environment, and how are you going to bridge both of those environments so you give your users a very seamless end user experience as they're trying to interact with all the different pieces of SharePoint. Something to keep in mind as you're planning your migration to make sure that all of that features and functionality that you need are going to be available to your users in the easiest way possible. In terms of planning your new architecture, you want to think about it almost as a completely new installation of SharePoint. You don't necessarily want to just take your SharePoint on-premises architecture and just plop it up into the cloud. There may be some things that you want to change about how you've set up SharePoint in the past. So a couple of things that you need to kind of think about. Is your current configuration working? Is the setup of all of your sites and site collections really something that makes sense for your organization? Or has it gotten a little bit bigger than you anticipated, and do you need to kind of scale that back or change some things about it? Are there customizations that you've made to your SharePoint environment that you no longer need? Now, one of the nice things about SharePoint on-prem is that it really gave you a nice platform to relatively easily make some customizations to the way SharePoint works so that you can add some additional features. Unfortunately, the way you made those customizations in your on-premises version is not necessarily the way you would make those customizations in your online environment, and in some cases, those same customizations aren't even available in your SharePoint Online environment. So it's going to be important to really take a hard look at what you've done in your SharePoint environment to make sure that those customizations really make sense. A lot of customizations that people made early on in their SharePoint environments have changed. There may be some things that you no longer have to do to get some of that functionality that you originally had to customize. But there are also things that people maybe just thought they wanted. Maybe there was a project that came up, and now you're really looking at it and determining, no, those customizations aren't really necessary. So definitely something to keep in mind as you're planning out that new architecture. The other thing that's important to look at is, what are your company's needs, not just today in terms of your SharePoint environment, but are you going to be able to grow with your company's needs as your company's needs grow? Very important to kind of keep that model in the back of your mind so that you do make an architecture decision that's going to make sense both now and in the future. Now, I mentioned migrating critical sites earlier, and again, this may seem a little bit unintuitive because some of those critical sites are something that all of your users use on an everyday basis. But the reason why I say that is specifically because they are critical sites. It's important to kind of make sure that all of that critical functionality that your entire company uses is working properly, and that you have all of the features and functionality needed to continue making those critical applications, those critical sites available to your users. So to do that, a couple of things that you want to look at. First, the best idea here is to test the transition with a single business unit or a single team. Don't just take all of your critical SharePoint sites and move them all at the same time. You want to do this one at a time so that you can make sure that all of the functionality is working properly before you move on to the next thing. So once you've picked that single business unit or team to look at, you want to make sure that you are absolutely clear on exactly what the functionality is that is critical in this particular team's SharePoint site. So is it workflows that they have in their environment? Is it forms that they have? Is it access to some specific critical content that everyone in the company needs? Very important to really understand what the needs are for this particular SharePoint site and make sure that all of those capabilities are still available and working properly in your online environment. You also want to make sure that any of that additional functionality that you need for the site, is it available via third-party tools or other third-party applications? If it is, again, you want to make sure that all of that is available and supported in your SharePoint Online environment. Once you've gotten all of those capabilities kind of figured out for your SharePoint site, move that site into your SharePoint Online environment while still keeping it in your on-premises environment so that there's no downtime. This makes transition in terms of an end user experience much more clean, and also gives you the ability to take your time and really make sure that everything is working properly before you make a complete cutover to the new environment. As I mentioned, one of the important things that we've learned is that you really want to move your content in stages. Now, it doesn't necessarily matter how you do it. You can look at it and take the most critical content first. You can do it site by site, however makes the most sense to you. But one of the things that you really want to look at doing is making that transition via a hybrid approach, which is something we've kind of talked about across most of these different steps, and it's very important so that you don't have that downtime for your end users. So take a look at your content and start moving it piece by piece into your environment. It's important to have a specific plan in place so that you know exactly what's being migrated when, so that you can avoid disruptions, but at the same time make sure that you're gathering key learning so that your subsequent stages of content migration move much more smoothly. And finally, one of the things that we have found when talking to our customers about migration is in some cases, it's just easier to start fresh. It's going to be easier in some cases if you have a lot of customizations that are going to be very difficult to move into your SharePoint Online environment. As I mentioned before, some customizations that customers have made were due to kind of limitations or some feature gaps in a previous version of SharePoint on-premises. Now that Microsoft has been doing a lot of additional work to add new features to SharePoint Online, this may be something where your customizations are no longer needed because the same functionality is available in SharePoint Online, no customizations required, and it's done in a slightly different way. So instead of trying to match the exact same functionality you had in your SharePoint on-premises environment, it may just be easier to move to the new environment and start using that same functionality in the new and correct way that it's been implemented. If you do decide to kind of make a fresh start, make sure your SharePoint Online environment is as clean as possible. The one thing that I can't stress enough is to talk to your business units, talk to the different teams across your organization, and have them provide an assessment of their needs for the SharePoint Online environment. This is something that I think a lot of people, when they first started using SharePoint, may not have done as much. And because of that, we've really seen kind of some SharePoint environments that really just aren't set up in the most efficient way as possible. But if you start early and get input from your business units, from the teams across your organization, you're really going to have a much more complete, usable SharePoint Online environment. Once you get all of those business needs documented and you understand exactly what needs to be done, you want to roll out all of your new sites using a phased approach. Again, this allows you to kind of take one piece of functionality, one set of teams' needs, make sure those get implemented properly, and then any learnings that you have from that initial implementation can then be used for subsequent phases in your migration. Definitely something that's an important piece to kind of a successful migration. And finally, if you didn't have a governance model set up in your SharePoint on-premises environment, this may be a great time to put that in place. So what exactly does that mean? Really, governance in your SharePoint environment is all about who can create SharePoint sites, what types of things can be added to a SharePoint site, and what can't be added to a SharePoint site. A governance model like this will really give you a nice, clean SharePoint environment and will ensure that as you grow, you're not kind of moving into that SharePoint chaos that we've seen so often in organizations who have really adopted and implemented SharePoint very, very quickly. Gives you the ability to really make sure that your users are getting the functionality that they need without putting things in your SharePoint environment that maybe shouldn't be there. So definitely something that's important. Certainly if you are considering a fresh start in your SharePoint Online environment, but also something that you can look at if you're kind of migrating existing sites into your online environment as well. Governance is something that we have seen certainly makes a huge difference in kind of a successful implementation of SharePoint, whether it's on premises or online. So as you're looking at putting together your plan for migrating to SharePoint Online, there's lots of different tools and resources that you have at your disposal. First of all, Microsoft has put together some great kind of best practice guidance documents that you can find on the support.office.com website. Really gives you some kind of good insights on some things that you need to think about. But then there's also been lots of different white papers and guides that have been put together by the SharePoint community at large. So definitely something to look at just in terms of best practices, maybe some pitfalls that people have run into when they have been doing their migrations. Definitely something to look at and check out as you're putting together your migration plan. Another great resource that you have in the SharePoint community is Microsoft Gold Partner Network. Now, I'm not going to give any recommendations on specific partners because there's a ton of partners all over the country that are really great SharePoint experts, but I will say that the best thing about the Microsoft Gold Partner Network is that these folks do this all the time. And that's something that is quite honestly very comforting when you're looking to do this migration that maybe you're a little nervous about or don't have a lot of kind of experience in. Any of the Microsoft Gold partners that are available in your region can help you make this migration plan much more successful because they've done this many times. So definitely something to look into if you're concerned about your migration at all and want some help. The Gold partners are a great resource for you to have. In terms of tools that you may be able to use, There are several different third-party migration tools out on the market today that help you kind of take all of your content that you have in your SharePoint on-premises environment and move that up into your SharePoint Online environment. Gives you kind of a nice automated way to make that migration a little bit easier. Lots of different tools out there. Metalogix is one that we have a partnership with at K2, but there are several others as well. And depending on what you need, one may be better than another. There are tools out there for just moving content. There are tools out there for moving things like workflows and forms. So it's really important to assess what your needs are before you take a look at those migration tools, because some may work better than others. In addition, you also have an opportunity to look at third-party application solutions that aren't necessarily specifically for helping you migrate content, but can help you kind of navigate some of the things that we run into when we're moving to SharePoint Online, things like feature parity, things like being able to build an application that kind of spans both your SharePoint on-premises environment as well as your SharePoint Online environment, and also kind of giving your end users that best possible experience. And that's one of the things that we at K2 do. We are specifically focused on tools that allow you to build business apps and workflows and forms. And one of the tools that we have specifically for SharePoint is our K2 Appit for SharePoint application. And I want to spend just a minute or two talking about what Appit provides for you, so you can get a sense of what some of the third-party applications that are available out on the marketplace might be able to do for you when you're moving to your SharePoint Online environment. So K2 Appit for SharePoint was specifically built around the idea of providing workflow and forms apps for SharePoint in a cloud-based environment. The nice thing about Appit is that it allows you to really kind of span your different environments and provides a nice way for building up that hybrid SharePoint environment that I mentioned previously. Appit is available for use in either your Office 365 SharePoint Online environment in the cloud, as well as your SharePoint 2013 environment on premises. And the nice thing about Appit is that the capabilities that you get in terms of building workflows, building forms, integrating those line of business systems are going to be the same across any of those environments. There's no feature parity gaps between your on-premises environment as well as your online environment, because we're kind of taking care of all of those capabilities for you and giving you the same features across the entire environment. Really gives you a nice way to build out those workflow and forms apps for your entire environment, so you don't have a lot of that concern about feature parity gaps in your environment. In terms of what applications built with Appit actually look like, all of our Appit environment is surfaced in your SharePoint, either online environment or your SharePoint 2013 on-prem environment. So in terms of an end user perspective, it's going to look like your users are using SharePoint. Very clean, nice interface for interacting with any applications that you have in your SharePoint environment. So a couple of key things that we provide that kind of give you capabilities above and beyond what you're going to get in SharePoint Online or SharePoint On-Prem, a filterable and searchable central task list. So this will give you access to all of those tasks that have been assigned to you from one central location, so that you don't have to kind of jump between different sites to see all of the different tasks that have been assigned to you. The other thing that we provide is a mobile application to give you mobile access to your SharePoint workflows and your SharePoint forms. In this particular case, we're showing our native iPhone app that gives you access to your tasks directly from your iPhone, but we also have applications for the other mobile devices, and we really give you a nice way to see your forms and any of your tasks that you have been assigned in your SharePoint environment directly from any mobile device, regardless of what particular platform you use. We also provide a lot of out-of-the-box reports that you're going to get to really give you a nice overview of what exactly is happening in your SharePoint environment in terms of applications that you're running. So the nice thing about our reports is that you have one centralized location that you can look at to see all of the information about any application in your SharePoint environment, and all of these reports are customizable, so you have access to make changes and display information that is the most important to you as an individual user. In terms of our forms capabilities, we do provide both forms and workflow design capabilities, really giving you a nice way to kind of customize your SharePoint forms to do maybe a little bit more than what you can do out of the box with some of the SharePoint Designer capabilities or with Visual Studio. So one of the nice things that we provide with our forms and our workflow designer is the ability to integrate other line of business system information so that you have one central view of kind of critical information that you need to get your work done. So in this case, this screenshot is showing a product launch form that needs to be filled out that shows some information that is stored in a SharePoint list, but then it also is bringing in some information from a CRM system so that you have kind of a nice integrated view into all of the information that you need for this particular product launch task. Really nice way to kind of provide your users a rich experience, all using that kind of SharePoint portal look and feel, so that they're very comfortable and don't need to kind of learn a new tool as they're moving to a different SharePoint environment. And finally, in terms of workflow, we also have our drag and drop visual workflow designer that really gives you the ability to build any type of workflow, no matter how complex or how simple you may need it to be. Our workflow designer gives you access to all of the capabilities within SharePoint for doing things like adding new SharePoint sites or updating content in your SharePoint environment. But then we also give you the ability to do to include tasks that may involve other line of business systems in your environment as well. So it really gives you a nice way to kind of build out those applications in SharePoint, and if you need to, also integrate with any line of business systems in your environment. Now, this tool really gives you a nice way not just to kind of build out those applications in your SharePoint environment, something like a leave request, for example, or an expense claim application that really gives your users kind of a nice interactive way to get their work done. But the other nice thing that we've had lots of customers do with our application is to build out kind of applications that manage their SharePoint environment for them. So one of the things we've seen a lot of is our customers using our workflow and forms tools to build out a SharePoint site provisioning application. Now this allows you to kind of have that governance model in place where someone can request a SharePoint site, and then a workflow is used behind the scenes to kind of approve that site request and then actually get all of those site assets up and running for the person without anyone having to do any manual setup. So something that a lot of our customers look at, definitely something to consider when you're moving to a new SharePoint environment, to really give you that kind of one more governance piece that you might need in your environment. Definitely kind of a nice way to provide all of the features and functionality that you need in your SharePoint environment, and really gives you the ability to build these applications that work seamlessly between your SharePoint on-premises environment as well as your SharePoint Online environment. Again, no feature gaps here between either of those environments. We handle all of that for you. And we also give you the ability to kind of talk to both of those SharePoint environments from any of your individual applications. So if you do have to use some of that hybrid environment configuration that I mentioned before, as you're kind of stage by stage migrating everything in your SharePoint environment, something like Appit for SharePoint really gives you a nice capability of making that happen without having to write a lot of custom code or adding some customizations to your SharePoint environment that aren't necessarily necessary. So just a very quick look at K2 Appit for SharePoint. If you do have any questions about Appit, I'm happy to answer those. If you want more information, you can always visit us at appit.com. We have lots of information about the product itself up on appit.com, but we also have several different white papers and webinars that are scheduled that really give you nice guidance just in general about how to use SharePoint, things to think about when you're migrating, etc. So definitely take a look at appit.com. In the meantime, if you do have any questions, I'm happy to answer those. So let's open it up for some questions. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Again, my name is Holly Anderson, and if you do want to reach me at any time, you can get a hold of me at holly@k2.com. Thanks again. Let's open it up for some questions.